Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, on behalf of the Norwegian Peacebuilding Resource Center and the Peace Research Institute Oslo, I'd like to welcome you to our panel discussion entitled Rising Powers, Regional Leaders or Global Players. This is a theme that is demanding to discuss because it works on so many different levels. First of all, there's the country-specific expertise that's needed, and further, an understanding of regional dynamics, and then finally, the application of both these perspectives to the global agenda. Luckily, today, we have an exceptional panel of experts whose work covers China, India, Brazil, and Turkey. So I would like to begin by introducing you. First of all, to my left here is Isabel Hilton. She is a London-based international journalist and broadcaster, and she's also currently the editor of ChinaDialogue.net. She has an MA honors in Chinese from the University of Edinburgh, has written for the Sunday Times, The Guardian, The Independent, and the BBC. And she's also been the editor-in-chief of OpenDemocracy.net. And she's a frequent commentator on China. Varun Shani, who is a professor in international politics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He edits the South Asian Survey, speaks at the National Defense College. His work is on nuclear deterrence issues, regional security, emerging balances in the Asia-Pacific, emerging powers, international relations theory, and Latin American issues. So quite a wide array of themes that he takes up. And he has also served as the 10th Vice Chancellor of the University of Jammu. Next to him is Marcel Fortuna Beato, who is the Brazilian ambassador to Bolivia. He's a career diplomat, has served in London, Berlin, and the United Nations. He, between 2003 and 2010, served as assistant to the President of Brazil's chief foreign policy advisor, and frequently is a commentator on Latin American politics, Brazilian foreign policy, global governance, and international law. Another Brazilian expert today is Alcides Costa Vaz, who is a professor of political science and a former director of the Institute of International Relations at the University of Brasilia. He is a well-known commentator on Brazil's foreign policy and the author of several books and studies on this country's foreign policy. Next to him is Monica Hurst. She is a Brazilian academic based in Argentina, holds a PhD in strategic studies, and works as a professor of the Department of Economics at the University of Quilmes. I'm not sure I'm saying that right, but she also teaches at the MA program in International Studies at the Torquato di Tella University, and is presently a fellow of the Program on International Cooperation for Development of IPA Brasilia, and has published extensively on Brazilian foreign policy, Latin America-US relations, and regional security and integration issues. And last but not least, a colleague, since I also am a researcher on Turkey, a colleague of mine, Oktay Tanrısever, who is an associate professor at the Department of International Relations of the Middle East Technical University in Ankara, Turkey. He is also the chairperson of the Area Studies PhD program at the same university, and his research interests include Turkey's foreign policy and energy diplomacy, conflict resolution and peace building in the Caucasus and the Black Sea region, security in the post-Soviet space, as well as theories of international relations. So as you see, we have quite a heavyweight panel here today, and who are a panel that I think is able to cover a wide variety of issues. As for me, my name is Pinar Tank, and I'm a research director here at the Peace Research Institute. And beyond that, I'm actually also a researcher on a Regions and Powers group that we have here that brings together scholars whose interests converge on the very themes that we're interested in discussing today, namely the questions of rising powers and regionalism. So a key theme for today is how regional leadership can be a stepping stone for global engagement. So much of the discussion will focus just on how rising powers either cooperate with one another or compete. This being the case that we have a panel who has a unique expertise in each of the rising powers, we've chosen a format that is a little bit unique, and you are all guinea pigs, which when I visualize you as such, helps my nerves anyway. And I am Oprah Winfrey of international relations. The way we are trying to go about this is to see if we can get an interactive discussion here, both among our panelists who each have this unique competence, but also with you who are sitting in the audience. It's not going to be the most structured discussion, but I'm hoping that that level of unstructured informality will give rise to a kind of energy in the kinds of questions that you're going to be putting forth. So what I would like to do is, first of all, give you an idea, or remind you rather, of the focus of the discussion today. We've chosen in particular 4 themes. The first, quite a natural one given that we're talking about rising powers, which is economic power translated into global responsibility? The second theme, can regional leadership be a stepping stone for global engagement? The third, looking at a more concrete case of the Arab Spring in Iran, how is the regional leadership, this aspect of regional leadership affect the way in which these powers act on the scene when we're looking at things that have happened in the Arab Spring and in particular Iran? And can regional approaches weaken global institutions such as the UN? So these are extremely wide and general questions, and I'm going to do my best to guide the discussion, beginning with a set of questions for the panel, and then opening it up to the audience. I'm aware that there's going to be quite a lot of questions on each theme, so I have to apologize ahead of time if you don't manage to get your question presented here and now. I'm hoping this will be one of many events that we'll have on rising powers. But I would like to be able to touch on all 4 themes, so I'm trying to structure it in a way that allows us to actually address each of them. I'll try not to be too strict, but if I am, you are allowed to interact with me and let me know. I think that if it begins to go too far and you see this green, it's not red, it's green, then the paper going up, then that's just a sign for you to perhaps wrap up your thoughts, and then we can move on. But perhaps we should begin with a few words on the concept of rising powers. It's worth reminding ourselves that although these countries are often grouped together under a common heading, the commonality in their approach to global issues varies considerably. Where there is a common basis of comparison, it's in the challenge that their rise presents to established powers. And quite often it's the term BRICS, referring to Brazil, Russia, India, and China and South Africa, that is used as a term interchangeably, in fact, with rising powers. But it's a label that we've moved away from because we feel that it's too limited for the discussion that we're going to have today on the concept of rising powers, which encompasses, as you see, a much broader range of countries than just those included in the BRICS. Yet the point remains that economic status implies a global engagement, or a global standing, if you will. Of course, that being said, the economic strength of rising powers also varies considerably. It's very difficult to have a comparable basis for looking at China and Turkey. One has the impression that in the case of Turkey, there is a kind of aspirational desire to be included in the club of emerging powers. And in the case of China, it's a label that's used to hide behind and to not necessarily step up to the global responsibility that its power implies. So the first question I would like to pose the panel today is, to which extent does economic power translate into global responsibility? This will allow us to discuss shifts in global power. And by this I mean, is it the case that the days of unipolarity are over and that we are now in a multipolar world order? Or is it a case of non-polarity? And more importantly, if we break down this concept of multipolarity, what does it actually mean? How has the nature of power changed? I think that to begin with, I would like to ask Alcides, as he's written on the subject of multipolarity and what it actually means in a conceptual sense.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to to be here, and since time is short, let's jump straight into the issue. Multipolarity. What does multipolarity means in an interdependent world? I think that, well, multipolarity is a traditional concept related to the distribution, to the pattern of power. So it's a concept traditionally ingrained in the literature, to international politics, to international strategics. It has to do with power concentration. And we all agree, it's a common sense from, at least from the early 70s, that we're living in an increasingly interdependent world. And how does interdependence affect polarity and multipolarity and the meaning of multipolarity and the nature of power? I think that multipolarity in a highly interdependent world as ours entails important changes in the nature of power and power relations, and does affect the very concept and understanding that we should have of multipolarity. If we agree that power is diffuse, on the one hand, we must also agree that there are concentrations of powers that are decisively shaping and influencing events and outcomes on different issue areas. So, it means to me that we should not be talking about multipolarity as a matter of power distribution among states themselves, but it's a matter of the exercise of power by a wider array of actors in global affairs. I think the content, the nature of the concept must be changed. We must treat the channels from the traditional literature on power relations and try to envisage that there are power concentrations comprised by a diverse array of political actors shaping and influencing international politics and international economics nowadays. So it's the meaning of multipolarity that's in question, and the nature of power also going through changes, and several different actors being brought into the field. So this is the first point. The rise of multipolarity is not a matter of power distribution among states any longer. And this also implies the need to reduce risks, to reduce vulnerabilities in a framework, in a context of deep interdependence, reinforces the roles and the political capabilities that states might need to develop, and their ability to work together with non-state actors. And that what's leading to a different pattern, not only of political exercise, of political relations, but also to a different structure, to a different power structure in global affairs. One in which the regional protagonism is a dimension of. And this opens also the way for the protagonism of regions in a multipolar world. I'm doing this very highly conceptual approach because I think it's necessary to address the core of issues that have been presented, that have been brought to the table. Multipolarity has also been associated to patterns of stability in global affairs. To part of the literature, multipolarity is associated to a more stable, actable order, to soft and hard balancing of power as sources of stability. However, historical experience also suggests that multipolarity entails conflict and instability. And this is an intriguing feature of contemporary international politics in the sense that, at the present, multipolarity, rising multipolarity, in the sense that I tried to describe before, coincides with a very significant decrease of interstate conflicts, on the one hand. But there are forces working in the sense of also triggering interstate conflicts in association to the control and access to natural resources, to the control of sensitive and strategic areas rendered as vital for the flow of goods, forces operating the quest for energy and food security. So, under this multipolar and interdependent framework, conflictivity, a new pattern of conflict is also rising. And this leads me to the last point.
Okay. I'm already using it.
The places of states and the regions to address part of the issues that have been said. It's not the case of arguing whether or not states keep on being the central actors. It's not the place, not the issue. But we may agree that states rely increasingly more on the interaction with non-state actors for the accomplishment of their nationally defined interests, to the accomplishment of their national objectives, for the successful pursuit of national, regional, and global policies. So state initiatives become and keep on being a basic requirement for the construction of global governance and for the construction of political and economic regionalism. However, most regions have failed in developing a political identity and to develop policy instruments that enable them to perform actively as actors in the world economy and in the world affairs. They are important, yes?
Could I just cut you off there, because I think we'll go into regions a little bit more in the second part of our discussion. Okay. So if you just hold that thought, and I've already had two requests to intervene on the comments that you brought forth on the multipolarity.
Okay, so let me just wrap up by saying that what I mean is regionalism has emerged as an important, regions are important referents in international politics and international economics, but they have not become actors as such. And that explains why some important key countries in their own regions have also resorted to other instruments such as international coalitions of like-minded countries, of emerging countries, to find more room to act in this global arena that I mentioned. That's the point I wanted to.
I think you framed the conversation very nicely conceptually for the next few issues as well. And I'd like to now go over to Varun, if that's okay, because I think you were the one who first, and then Monica after him.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump straight to it. I mean, I think there are three different types of changes, and I think one of the problems is that if we aren't careful, we may conflate these. And the three different types of changes taking place simultaneously in international politics. One of them really is about new problems and new issue areas that haven't existed in the past. So, you know, how one begins to deal with them, even think about them, let alone sort of formulate policy about them, you know, becomes, I think, in some ways a very different core type of challenge. There are a second set of changes, however, which is old problems, old issues, but new ways of approaching them, new ways of doing them, you know, doing things, tackling them. And I think, you know, out here we begin to start thinking about, you know, such things perhaps as multilateralism. You know, we start thinking about, you know, non-state actors getting into the picture as players, and so on and so forth. And then there's a third set of changes, which I think are really about, you know, old problems, old ways of doing things, but new actors. And I think, you know, we need to keep that in mind, you know, which is really just a function of changing power differentials. You know, as power differentials change, the game remains the same. It's sovereign territorial politics in some form or the other. But the players are now different. The actors are now different, and I think in some ways we've got to, if we try to making sense of this changing global order, understand that there are three types of changes, and they're taking place simultaneously. That's one point I wanted to make. Another point really is that I'd like to sort of, you know, since we are still sort of in the conceptual realm here, distinguish between emerging powers and rising powers. And a lot of my writings, I sort of, say, and this drives some of my Chinese sort of, friends up the wall, but I say China is rising, India is emerging.
I'd to explain that.
And I think it's more than sort of, a semantic difference. Rise implies, a systemic role today. A rising power is one that is already a significant systemic player. And what that power does or does not do is going to have a direct policy impact today. An emerging power, on the other hand, is a state that is a middle power that has signaled its capability and its willingness to maneuver its way into systemic roles.
There you would place India, like Turkey?
I would place India, I would place Brazil. I have a huge query on Turkey, which is why I'm delighted that Turkey is a part of this conversation. I would certainly say that there are other states we need to be sort of looking at quite carefully, like South Africa, Nigeria perhaps, Indonesia. So there are a bunch of sort of middle powers in the system. Middle powers are states, really, that do not have the system shaping capabilities of the great powers, but which are far too important, significant, because of their location, their size, so on and so forth, to be out of any major power calculus. So they're a part of the calculus, but they aren't really fundamentally playing a determining role in that calculus. So those are the middle powers. And some of these middle powers, over time, develop the capabilities and the willingness, both of those are important, to sort of maneuver their way to great power status, to systemic status. And I think some of these states, and I would definitely put, for me, the iconic emerging powers actually are Brazil and India. I mean, I think even on South Africa, we can raise a whole bunch of issues. So that's the second sort of, I think, a rather important, for me at least, important point. And then, of course, I mean, I think also, the difference between multipolarity and multilateralism, which I'm just going to signal here because I've already sort of, in a way, when I've talked about 3 types of changes, suggested that, that really, when we're talking about multipolarity, we're talking really about configurations of power in the international system. And we're therefore in the realm of the 3rd type of change I suggested. Multilateralism is really somewhere in the realm of the 2nd type of change, where we're trying to find new ways of doing things, very often because we have to. I mean, environmental issues, we simply can't, the sovereign territorial state simply cannot deal with environmental issues, which aren't absolutely local in nature. I mean, the moment you really get beyond municipal limits, we're talking about, at the minimum, a bunch of states acting together, acting in concert. So I mean, the sovereign territorial state just simply isn't the best unit to take decisions. And I think that's where a whole bunch of multilateralism and, a different way of doing things, in other words, comes into the picture. But that can exist, I think, quite easily with sovereign territorial politics. I mean, that's the point. So you'll have sovereign territorial states, in effect, themselves deciding that there are some issue areas where they just simply have to work together, work in concert. I think that's all I'll say at this point. I'll probably jump in on the regions a little later.
But you brought up an interesting point on the need for both capacities and willpower for a country to be considered a rising power. How does China fit into this? Because you named China particularly as a rising power, not an emerging power, if I've understood you correctly. Maybe
I think Isabel's probably a better person to sort of address this than me, but it seems to me where I'm located, a place south of the Himalayas, with China having effective control over the Tibetan plateau. I mean, I think we most Indian analysts have a sense of where China is already.
I think that's an illustration of the difficulty of considering Asia as a regional bloc, and Asia of all the regions, I think, is notoriously difficult to define. And you have real fissures and fault lines, both culturally and politically within Asia, which I think I can't see being overcome. I can't see Asia acting as a regional bloc. So what does China do within Asia, the biggest power within Asia, at least the biggest economy within Asia, with a relationship of its neighbors have, in many cases, a relationship of considerable economic dependence. China runs a trade deficit with most of its neighbors, importing components, unlike its trade relationship with OECD countries. Perhaps the biggest military, I'm not quite sure how the state of Indian military, but in any event, a substantial military capability. But the sheer weight of China and China's attempt to assert some kind of leadership in Asia has precipitated quite a strong reaction amongst other Asian states. So, for instance, Vietnam, never a friend of the United States, has been pushed into the arms of the United States over the incipient conflict in the South China Sea. India, I think we're well aware of what India feels about China. China doesn't really feel the same way about India. China doesn't feel threatened by India, but it does feel that its big challenge in Asia is Japan. And China's ambition to keep the United States out of Asia has actually backfired because the United States has explicitly said that its foreign policy focus in the next decade is going to be in the Asia Pacific. So, in terms of China asserting a leadership, a regional leadership, it's very problematic and not at all clear. In general terms, I wanted to say something about how Chinese foreign policy is made and what it's about. And it is, I think, more than many countries, driven by domestic anxieties. China's government spends most of its time thinking about domestic issues. And foreign policy is a function of maintaining growth and stability at home. So the stated policy of keeping a low profile and building economic strength really remains at the core of Chinese foreign policy, and most of it is about securing energy and securing resources. So if you look at the incipient conflicts, they are about resources. If you look at the places in which China frustrates what we might call the international will, so over Iran, over Syria, over Darfur, it's all about energy. And this is the primary anxiety of the Chinese government, which fears a loss of legitimacy and a loss of power should the economic engine falter. The economic engine's need for resources is so phenomenal that this drives China into relationships with third countries and challenges to buyers in competition of energy that are all driven by a domestic agenda. So if you look at how foreign policy is formed, it's not clear-cut. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China ranks about 9th in the political pecking order. And in any of the bureaucratic posts or ministerial posts, what you need to look at is not so much the state organogram, but what the party position is of the relevant minister, because the party positions always trump the political positions. So foreign policy emerges in many odd ways in China, but not necessarily as what you might think of as a kind of rational structure. Many people contribute, many think tanks contribute, the party school contributes, and increasingly the state-owned enterprises, the big economic powers within China, make their own foreign policy. It's not at all clear that the MFA has any influence over how big economic powers in China behave, and that drives the relationship within Africa, for instance, many in Latin America. So I am sorry if this is a confusing picture, but it is a confusing picture, and I think that there is a tendency in international relations to regard China as a kind of predictable actor in international affairs, and I simply enter the note of caution about how policy is made and therefore why we find it perhaps sometimes unpredictable.
But you do bring up an interesting point, which we can pursue in a moment, I think. But perhaps also, Monica Hurst, you'd like to comment on this idea that foreign policy is really an extension of the domestic agenda. Because, of course, there's a lot of identity building also in foreign policy, and you see that both in Brazil and in Turkey. I had you on my list earlier, Monica, so I don't know if that's what you want to comment, but you're free to, yeah.
Okay, I'll try to do both.
Okay.
And I'm going to move back a little bit to the conceptual discussion, but then, I mean, since we've moved ahead already, putting faces to names regarding countries and national identities, I will also try to put that in my comments. I want to move back to the conceptual discussions to bring in two aspects which I think could be relevant also. The first one is a very simple conclusion, which is that the whole idea that Alcides was mentioning before regarding the rising multipolarity, I think it's very important that we underline the transitional essence of the moment we are going through. I mean, and the fact that we have unclear pictures, as Isabel was mentioning in the case of China, I think it regards all important old and new actors. I mean, and transitions usually bring in unclear pictures until we go over. I mean, we end the period of transition. So, and it's part of the historical process in which we now find ourselves. The second aspect that I also want to bring back from what Alcides mentioned, which I think can be very important also to understand this transition in which we find ourselves regarding an international order, is that it is true that we do not face a period of interstate rivalry, of interstate conflict, but we are facing a period of an enormous and deepening conflict, period of rivalry. And the fact of interstate rivalry being part of this transition period, I think it's very important because it really characterizes the building of a multipolar order as an extremely competitive order, in the sense in which we, and this is one of the essences of the period, in which we have different areas of competition regarding the rising powers, regarding the emerging powers, which I think Varun very well distinguishes. And one of the distinctions between the rising and the emerging powers, which is important, is the fact that for the emerging political coalitions is a very important tool. So even though you want to leave BRICS and IPSA on the side, I think in this discussion, it is important to understand this, the instrumental nature of political coalitions between emerging powers in these moments, much more than in the case of what Varun was mentioning as a rising power. And here also the importance of multilateralism. Multilateralism as an end, multilateralism as a mean. Mm-hmm. And for the rising powers, in both cases, multilateralism has an enormous instrumental importance for these countries. And the last aspect which I would like to mention has to do with the fact that for emerging powers, soft power attributes have become extremely important regarding not only the possibility of having a more important say in regional and in global governance arenas, but also as a possibility of building up like-mindedness among emerging powers, even though there is a very strong competitive edge also in their relationship.
I think you brought up an interesting point on soft power, and before I give the floor to Oktay, I was wondering, Marcel, would you like to say a little bit about Brazilian soft power, because you're actually in the field and working with soft power on a daily basis as an ambassador?
Well, thank you, and good afternoon to all. Very briefly, and maybe trying to weave that into the initial conceptual, let's say, thought that was brought up, I would start by saying that just as all politics is local, I would say that our powers are fundamentally regional, in the sense that not that you need a power base, but you have a sense of where your roots and your structural basis of support, and ultimately the trajectory, the historical process by which you achieved whatever degree of responsibility or visibility. I think that's certainly the case in the case of Brazil that you asked me to refer to more specifically. I think it brings out the fact that certainly, as you asked about the importance of economics, that is critical. Obviously, you have to have the fundamental material resources on which to base any kind of projection. But also coming back, as you said, to the issue of soft power, and maybe bringing in something about systematic versus, let's say, emerging attributes. The question, I think, ultimately has to do with the fact that I believe globalization is increasingly a regionalized process. Globalization as a general concept means interdependence. I don't think it necessarily tells you that much about how the global order is going to be structured. Balance of power, are we going to have 3 or 4 major powers or just one power? Regionalization or globalized regionalization, I think, suggests that, well, soft power, if that's the right word, the ability to use your local circumstance as a means to project internationally. And that's what foreign affairs is about. It's about translating your vision of how your society is organized into a vision of not only its role overseas, but its own, let's say, almost in some ways missionary vision of how the world could be ordered. I would say that is the fundamental, let's say, policy scenario in which Brazil operates. Why? Brazil has always seen itself as a universal country for historical, ethnic, religious, even linguistic attributes. It is a country that I can fairly say that, other than from the Indian subcontinent, has received major immigration waves from just about every possible place on the earth. And so this is part of a new world vision, as where Western New World vision of recreating a better world, where almost paradise on earth from the 15th century. The notion that you have brought together currents and people from all sorts of, from all parts of the world. In the case of Brazil, Arab and Jewish, African, European, and that you have managed to forge a fairly unified and society. I think these are the fundamental concepts that allows the country to argue that if I can deal at a domestic level with fundamental issues of religion, of social justice, of religious bigotry, of tolerance, then I can do something, especially if I'm relatively big. I have lots of natural resources, and maybe even more importantly, I'm not in the middle of all the major cross currents of conflict. I can afford to project myself as a soft power, and I can argue that I don't threaten anyone. Rather, I have maybe some of the answers to some of the world's burning questions. So in a very obviously simplistic and almost propagandistic way, I think this sort of reflects some of the fundamental, let's say, undercurrents that leads the country to believe that it has a major role to play. And that's where I, just to finish, would suggest that when we talk about systematic versus regional or let's say emerging influence, I think these play in a very, it's hard for us to say exactly whether this is can actually divide things that way. We like to talk in Brazil about variable geometry, diplomacy, which means that you relate to different actors according to your specific attributes and comparative advantages. Mm-hmm. Maybe more important, rather than having a mass of, or a large mass of a specific source of power, be it economic, political, or anything else, it's your ability to intertwine them into networks that provide you visibility and to play in different chessboards at the same time. So I would say that this is, to a large extent, how Brazilians generally look to the international scenario from the perspective of a country that while not having hard military power or not yet in significant degree, probably feels that this is the card they should play and will continue to play over the coming years.
I think that what you're saying here is very interesting with retrospect, especially to Turkey, because of course Turkey uses the same idea of soft power and yet is in an entirely different situation in the region where there is conflict, where previously they talked about zero problems with neighbors and now they jokingly talk about zero neighbors without problems. I would like to give the floor to Oktay now to talk a little bit. Also, if you could touch on this, the connection that was made here between the domestic agenda and the foreign policy agenda, because you say yourself that it's because you can resolve disputes at home that you have this power of attraction, this soft power. Tell us a little bit about what's happening with Turkey and how they see soft power.
I would like to thank, first of all, Noref and Priya and Marian Akera and Pınartan for organizing this event and inviting me. Before coming to your question, I would like to make some theoretical remarks concerning this polarity analysis. I think it is mostly related to political realist understanding of international relations. We cannot really base our analysis on polarity if we use liberal or other approaches to international relations. This approach was quite explanatory during Cold War years when the world was quite polarized. But today, in a globalizing world, I think we need new approaches to international relations and also redefine the concept of power from, I mean, the existing ones, especially the polarity, is based on the state-centric notion of power, where focus is on the control of one actor by the other one. So, I mean, Hans Morgenthau defined power as an ability to get what others do what you want. So it's more state-centric. It doesn't explain the cases where we are unable to get what we want, even we are superior to others. Take the example of Vietnam, for example, or some other cases where superpowers confronted small powers, but they were not able to get what they wanted. But this doesn't make the superpower powerless. So we need, I think, a different way of defining power, which is, I think, in today's world, it is more relational, not actor-centric. The relational way of defining power focuses on ability to do things collectively. Because in a globalizing world, most of the problems that states try to deal with are not mainly about controlling others, but realizing their own objectives. And they have common interests, usually in some cases. And that's why I think more collective understanding of power, more cooperative understanding of power is needed to explain the changes in today's world and also challenges that states face. Concerning this soft power issue, hard power and soft power, I think the soft power concept is quite useful. I mean, I agree with Joseph Nye's definition or concern with soft power. Most of the states today are interested in realizing their objectives by using the soft power rather than hard power. Room for using hard power is extremely limited, and the military power has become quite dysfunctional for domestic and international contexts, in these contexts. But soft power is quite effective because it is, as Joseph Nye said, it is about being attractive to others. So if your policies are also in the interest of other actors, there is room for cooperation. Countries could find the common ground and pursue their interests collectively. But he changed this concept. As you know, now it is smart power.
Yes. Yeah.
Because being soft and hard, that distinction doesn't really explain the nature of power, which is more relational. We cannot say that we operate on the basis of culture only, but we also need some physical elements of power. Power combines both elements, and I may discuss this issue maybe in the second round when we discuss economics, which is more physical, more related to more material aspect of power. Concerning your question that soft powers, why these emerging powers tend to use soft power, and in Turkey's case, Turkey has become model in the Arab world. Maybe we could discuss that topic again later. This is also related to this changing nature of power. Turkey, I think, has become more open to the world. I mean, internally and externally, and it is in the process of reintegrating with the globalizing world. And this resulted in the successful reforms in its domestic politics and the resolution of some of the long-lasting conflicts and democratization inside the country. And this increased Turkey's image, and it affected Turkey's image positively abroad. Because Turkey has been focusing on the relational aspect of its power. It is trying to be part of the world in general. For a long time, it has been isolationist in its policy, but I can discuss these in detail later when we discuss Arab Spring and the economic power issues.
Thank you. I saw there was 2 hands here on the panel, but I would also like to open up for questions. So, Monica, and can you wait, or would you like to have just a brief comment before we move on?
It's a very, very brief.
Perfect, then. Yeah.
Because I think that it's important. I mean, just to mention that the question of soft power attributes, and I think it's one thing, and that's, I guess that Nye was thinking more of the U.S. Experience in itself, and the fact that you use soft power to make yourself attractive when you are overusing your hard power attributes and not making yourself attractive in world politics. So, and the other thing is to overstretch soft power attributes as your entrance fee in world politics, which is the case of rising powers. And I think it's a different approach to the soft power attributes in world politics on one side. The second point, I think that the relational dimension is a very important corollary of the soft power attributes. And in fact, the Brazilian-Turkey Accord for Iran and the attempt to use this accord at the time to bring in a more comprehensive and a more multilateral dimension to working with Iran, bringing in Iran, and not working on Iran just with hard power methods as sanctions and coerciveness in general. So I think that's...
Yeah. I think we will go and we will discuss Iran after we've had a chance at some questions of the first conceptual, but I'd like to give Isabel just 2 words, and Varun, can you wait till later?
It's probably slightly longer than that. It's about soft power.
You can have more than 2 words.
Can I have more than 2 words?
Soft power and the Chinese perception.
I mean, soft power is a massive state project in China, and has been, I mean, particularly got a boost since 2008, which, as you recall, was Olympic year. And that year began with an uprising in Tibet, and eventually spread across the Qinghai Tibet plateau. So in the year in which the Chinese leadership was to demonstrate to its people that it was loved around the world and the sacred torch of the Olympics was going to be welcomed by the masses everywhere, it began extraordinarily badly with an image of Chinese suppressing Tibetan people. The Chinese felt very strongly that the reporting of Tibet, in particular, had been distorted by malice and bias in the Western press, and therefore resolved that they couldn't rely on the Western media to be fair about China, and that China would have to set up its own international media in order to get China's story out, in order to challenge the perceptions of the West about China, and, as they would put it, the distortions. So an enormous state investment was put into setting up television in English and many other languages, publishing newspapers in English and many other languages. But it comes back to what was said about Brazilian soft power. The degree to which you can resolve your domestic issues and make yourself attractive is a very important determinant of soft power. So what's the Chinese problem? It's that it operates at home a highly authoritarian and controlled information system of newspaper censorship, of internet censorship, and of a very strong state-directed official national narrative, which does not translate onto the international stage without challenge. So you launch an international television station in English, and the first big story that comes up is that Liu Xiaobo has been given the Nobel Prize. So the poor man who is in charge of the news that day has a choice of two suicides. You know, he runs the story and he loses his job. That's one suicide. He doesn't run the story, and his television station loses all credibility. And that is the problem with Chinese soft power. Now, there are ways in which Chinese soft power is relatively successful. There are more and more students of Chinese. You know, as China rises, people are studying Chinese. More and more people are going to China to study. They are dwarfed, I have to say, by the number of Chinese who go abroad to study. And in every encounter that China organizes in its soft power push, two recent examples. The London Book Fair, one of the biggest publishing trade fairs in the world, had a China market focus this year. And predictably, it caused a row, not a slightly different row from Frankfurt, but nevertheless quite a major row. A list of 21 authors was invited, selected by the British Council, approved by the Chinese government. English Pen immediately pointed out that there were more writers in prison than there were on the official delegation, or the exile writers began to attack the list. And so this kind of, you know, hooray, let's exchange cultures, became again a row about how China manages its internal affairs. Last week I was in Brussels for the launch of the third pillar of dialogue between the EU and China, the people-to-people dialogue. I can't tell you how many civil society fora I have attended with China, and there is a fundamental problem with people-to-people dialogue. If you go into civil society, which is that on one side you have NGOs, individuals, artists, and on the other side, on the Chinese side, you have gongos, you have state-organized non-governmental organizations. and so, you know, this is not a match, and it's not a match because China's internal arrangements, you know, are mostly not a match for the countries that it's trying to reach out to. It is not, on the whole, attractive, and it's a profound difficulty for a country that is trying to make itself attractive enough to defuse resistance to its increasing economic power, which includes buying up well-known brands, includes buying up well-loved companies, improves trying to import higher and higher technologies. All of these depend, acceptance of these, depend on China's presentation of itself in a successful soft power enterprise as a non-threatening power. And we'll see how it plays out, but so far it's been a very limited success.
Thank you very much. Quite a different, each country has such a different understanding and approach to soft power, as you've all highlighted here, and the challenges. And then there's some similarities as well, I see, between one thing being the rhetoric outwardly, another thing being what's actually happening on the ground internally. I would like to open the floor, and I realize that we've now gone about 50 minutes into our time, and we've sort of touched on the two first questions rather than just the first. And the conversation between you I thought was so interesting, I didn't want to sort of break it down. So I'll give the floor to questions, and please be brief, say who you are, and if you're not brief, the green card really does go up. And I see Bertrand is there with the microphone. Let's see, I'll just start from the front row here. Yes, please, Bertrand.
Oh, is the both?
Yes, for you, please, yeah.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to all of you for a very interesting.
Could you just introduce yourself? Your name?
Oh, my name is Gisélia Bezerra. I am a researcher at FAFO, Institute for Applied International Studies. And thank you, all of you, for a very, very interesting, at least for me, debate. Many of you mentioned multilateralism as being very important in this transitional moment. How do you see, my question is, how do you see the dynamics of power changing and interplaying at existing and emerging multilateral forums? That's the question.
Okay, that's a rather large question, but is there anyone in particular you'd like to answer it?
No.
Okay, all right, well then we will get that one to be up for grabs. Shall we just take that question now, since it's such a large question? How do you see the dynamics of power changing, if I understand, in multilateral fora? Would you like to start?
Yeah.
Or maybe, yeah.
I'll see.
Well, I think that multilateralism associated to intergovernmental spaces, intergovernmental fora, has been the best expression of some intents of power shifts being translated into political outcomes. But I think that that does not suffice to, it's not enough to convey an assessment of the actual political capabilities of rising and emerging powers. I think that somehow multilateralism enhances, if we want to put it to the limit, it exaggerates the real political capabilities of some emerging countries. Because there are rules, there are decisional procedures, there is a favorable environment for bargaining. Okay, this is soft power being exercised. And the ability to translate that into results we may regard as power itself, or power being displayed effectively. I'm okay with that. But if we relate that to the attributes of individual nations and to the power resources that they may display at the end of the day to really deal effectively on the core issues of international politics, we'll see that there is a huge gap. Multilateralism has always been a very important source of to narrow asymmetries in international affairs. And it's important in this sense. But I just want to draw your attention to how huge the disparities have become in the sense not of GDP, economic influence, military influence, but inability of working together with different actors in framing sources and centers of influences in global politics. And again, regionally, the regions have not provided this framework. At the moment, multilateralism has provided it. Okay.
Okay.
reasons made in my first set of comments. Human rights to a lesser extent, but where human rights / governance, standards, I think is how I would put it, rather than just human rights per se. And I think some very interesting things are happening there. I mean, I think how common yet differentiated responsibility is being analyzed, I think is really, really interesting. I think the global south, particularly when it comes to environmental issues, is being fractured, far less than in the case of trade, but I think in the case of trade as well. And I think it makes perfect sense. I mean, there's no way in which the small island states can have the same set of interests as the large industrializing economies, period. There's no way in which sort of, the energy producing developing countries can have the same sets of interests as the small island states, and so on and so forth. So there's some very interesting things happening there. But I really would like to hear what Beato has to say, so I'll turn the mic towards him.
Thank you.
I'll be just as telegraphic. No, just to maybe bring nuance and a little bit of confusion into the debate by suggesting that I think multilateralism as we know it is basically a construct of the early 20th century, certainly pinnacle in 1945, and fundamentally construct of the then hegemonic power. So multilateralism as we know it is basically the outward expression of a worldview of one country and how it organized itself, at least with certain immediate allies. And it's not more and it's not less than that. I think what we see today is basically the progressive deconstruction of this whole set of scenarios. Very briefly, I think I don't like this kind of language too much, but hegemony basically means the ability to impose yourself. We go into some of the debate we had earlier about power. What is power? Hard power, soft power, how making yourself agreeable or tolerable. I think it's the question of providing the so-called global commons. And I think what we see is insofar as this construct no longer, for different reasons, is no longer able to provide some of these commons in terms of global security, obviously imposed to a degree. Economic stability also imposed to a degree. The diseconomies become more obvious. The contradictions of a democratic power that sort of bullies itself around in many ways. So this deconstruction process, I think, has at least two sides, both of which we've heard this today. One is a fracturing into increasingly thematic issues, whereby the natural opposition to the hemagon, be it the global south, previously it was an unaligned movement, or the Eastern Bloc, themselves collapse and dissolve. And on the other hand, I think despite what Alcides' concerns, I think there is a devolution to some degree at the regional level, and that obviously, as he was also suggesting, depends on the ability of coalescing, which obviously means a critical role for the specific emerging powers in each of these continents. In the case of Latin America, it has to do with Brazil's perception of how it can use a region as a platform or not. In the case of Asia, more complicated. You have different competing actors and visions. So I think it's a very fractured, very confusing scenario, but I tend to see it basically within the framework of the deconstruction of an existing, let's say, largely hegemonic process, which took the form and language of multilateralism, but now has to be defined along some of these basic fracturing forces. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's see, another question. I'll take maybe two questions this time. Mariano first, and then the gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much. Mariano Aguirre, the director of the Norwegian Peace Building Resource Center. Thank you very much for all your very good presentations. My question is about the United States. My question is about, I think that there is a general consensus that the US is either in decline or a very big, deep crisis. And I would like to know, how do you see how this crisis is addressed from at least the 4 countries that we are dealing with this afternoon, and particularly from the perspective, the double perspective. One is the impact of the, I would call it, empty space, particularly in the multilateral relations and in the international relations that the US is generating, or the crisis of the US is generating. And the second point is that from the perspective of confronting or supporting a big power in decline. This is particularly important from the perspective from China, for example. Is China interested in the US will really go deeper in the decline, or is it interesting for China to support the US? Thank you very much.
Thank you. If I can also have one more question, perhaps from the gentleman in the back there, with the glasses there.
Oh, hello, Per Norheim Martinsen from the FAFO Institute of Applied International Studies. Well, thank you for a very interesting panel so far. I think, actually, I remember especially Sani's 3 processes of change, which I thought was very well put, actually. But I think still that your last kind of change trajectory, old problems, old solution, but new actors, really tend to sort of explain quite a lot still. And I think this particularly goes to our understanding of China. We tend to think about China as being so special, right? And of course, with power comes assertiveness. And of course, China obviously wants to be feared. But then again, it also wants to be liked, which means that it still operates within the UN system. It wants to change the global financial economic system, but it does very little to do so, actually. And I think also your remark about its energy dependency, energy security. I just remember an old professor when asked about whether or not oil was the reason for the Iraq war. He just said, well, all wars are about resources, so what does it really explain? So this is a kind of specific questions about China. Do we need a China theory? Or is not just China an emerging power like everyone else in history? Which leads me to the more general question, which is basically, do we need an emerging power theory? Or is this not just normal state of affairs?
And I would actually add, are the emerging powers so different that one theory can't possibly encompass all of them? And I think that's really what you're also pointing to. Should we start? Would you mind, Isabel, if we started with the last question, since it was so pointedly addressed to you?
It was pointedly addressed to me, but since I'm the one person on the panel who's not an international relations specialist, I think you
Everyone
might find
else is free to.
This is one. Do we need a China theory? Well, the question of whether China thinks we need a China theory, put it that way. China certainly has a doctrine of exceptionalism. And it's as true and untrue as any other doctrine of exceptionalism. So to that extent, I think, yeah, given China's self-perception, I think to a certain extent, yes, we do need a China theory. Whether one China theory encompasses, the many contradictions of China is another issue. So what does energy hunger explain? Well, I mean, it explains a fair bit when you're, 1/5 of the world's population. I mean, a lot of what is singular about China is as General de Gaulle put it so perceptively, China's a very big country and a lot of people live there. And it is, just the scale and the speed of China's rise, turns the banal into the inescapable. So I think we shouldn't, dismiss China's resource hunger and its internal contradictions, because then you actually miss the main point. In terms of the decline of the United States, well, China has a kind of, I guess, ambivalent feeling about this. I mean, the power against which China constantly measures itself is, of course, the United States, which is not necessarily to say that it wishes to emulate the United States. I don't think that there is a plan for the projection of lethal force in China beyond a couple of local problems. And I think that would be a very long way off. It's not true that China has never been an expansionist power. I mean, it's doubled in size since the 17th century. But it's a land-based empire, and I would doubt that we will see China fight in other than any local conflict for a very long time. But it is interested in frustrating United States power. It's not interested, in my view, in the US collapse. And if you look at what happened at the beginnings of the financial crisis, there was extremely close coordination between between China and the United States on how to deal with the crisis in the short term. And China's own enormous stimulus package was in many ways a response. I mean, China and the United States are bound together economically in ways that we're all familiar with. China holds US government debt. China needs US markets. So decline, yes. Collapse, no. And I mean, where China would confront the use of US power, it would not seek, it would support the US in, I think, a domestic difficulty.
Thank you. Let's see, I think I had Varun and then Monica.
Let me address the second set of questions first. Do we believe in emerging power theory? I hope so, because I'm working on one right now. Well, I mean, I think that there are two interesting processes taking place here, just to sort of let some of my story out before I publish it. I think there are two processes on. One is a process of, really, taking inspiration from Roman Catholic liturgy. It's a process of transubstantiation in some way. It really is. It's, that's the external dimension. There is always something tautological in the definition of great powers. One of the tautological elements is that a great power is a state that is recognized by other great powers as a great power. Mm-hmm. That definition goes back 3 decades or more to Jacques Levy's sort of, and it's absolutely right. So there is a tautology at the heart of it, and I think the transubstantiation element comes in there. There's something externally in terms of perceptions, and a moment comes when you just begin to feel that, look, you've got to, this state has to now be treated in very, very different terms from how it has been treated earlier, because to not do so would be to completely get the system out of whack in some way. So I think that's one element. But there's another element which is internal. And out there, it's really not so much Roman Catholic liturgy as entomology. It's just really, it's a process of metamorphosis. It's about how really a fairly large state, but nevertheless a weak one, through a whole process of internal transformation, becomes a much stronger state. And that, I think, is also the second element in sort of emerging powers, which is that they've always been middle powers. So they've always been significant in a way. They've always been a part of sort of calculus of relative power. But the fact that they now become much stronger as states sort of completely then changes the role that they are playing. And it's something internal, but it ends up having an external sort of systemic impact. About the United States, just 3 things very, very quickly. The first is that, in some ways, the U.S. is only the 3rd systemic hegemon. And it's important to remember that. 1648 is the notional year when the Westphalian system began. France under Louis XIV, Britain, Victorian Britain, and now the United States. So in 3.5+ centuries, only the third instance of hegemony. And that's pretty important to remember. So it's a rather exceptional moment in that sense in international history. If history is any guide at all, to the extent that you can sort of compare an agrarian centralized state with a maritime trading empire with whatever the United States is, the fact still is that once a hegemony has been established in the system, it does last a while. I think it's important to keep that. This is a country that still is spending half of all global military spending. And it's not just half of all global military spending. Most of this military spending is going into technology. So it's not just a quantitative gap, it's a qualitative gap. And if you look at the other 9 states in the top 10 list, they're all the friends or allies of the United States. So in a way, it's rather silly to even sort of put it in the other column. They should actually be aggregated to the American column in terms of aggregate power. The only other among the top 9 who could, even in some bizarre thing, be seen as waging war against the United States are China and Russia. All the other states, are either allies or friends of the United States. So I think this is something to keep in mind. Now, I think the US in Asia is very interesting, because the United States has always been present in Asia, but during the Bush years, is very curiously absent in policy terms. because the focus, the central theater was the Middle East. And I think that policy absence, in a way, led to some rather interesting developments across Asia. But I think, with the change of administrations and as sort of the whole global war on terror became yesterday's story, and, what's happening is actually very natural. What's going to happen now is that the cockpit of world affairs, the central theater, and, the place where sort of the global sort of center of gravity is, are all now going to become that same region, which is the Asia Pacific. And that's the process that's now taking place. And I think the United States is going to be a fundamental part of that process. I mean, any notion that you're going to have the United States out of the Asia Pacific is absurd, because you can't talk about the landmass called Asia without considering the oceans around it. The moment you get the Pacific into the picture, the United States is the quintessential Pacific power. So any notion that somehow you can have in Asia, as Mahathir once said, his dream was a caucus without Caucasians. But it's going to be very difficult to have a caucus without Caucasians, because one whole sort of bunch of countries and one littoral of the Pacific are Caucasians of one variety or the other. So I think that's important. And the U.S.-India, finally, these relations during the Cold War years were terrible for two countries that were democracies. But it's been a slow process of improvement ever since. And I think during the Bush years, whatever their impact may have been on the rest of the world, the impact in the context of India was very, very positive, I think, on the whole. It's still something that's deeply contested within India in terms of politics, about the role of the United States and relations with the United States. But those relations, I would argue, have been steadily improving from the 1990s onwards. Towards the end of the Clinton term, they sort of began to have a certain amount of traction. Bush had an instinctive understanding of India, which is quite strange, and I think was linked in some ways to his having been governor of Texas, where there's some very important high technology universities. And his interaction with some of these high-tech universities when he was governor of Texas, where he found all these Indians, in the engineering department, and this sort of it had a major impact on the way he began to view India. So a lot of the change was actually White House driven. It's important to understand that, and that's what's different from sort of this period, this administration. Well, I mean, I think I wanted to say something on China, but if we ever have discussed regions, I'll probably try to weave China into that.
Yes.
Let me stop right now.
I'm going to try and get us towards regions, but I'll give two more comments here, and I'm continuing just because I think they're so. I'll give all three then. Monica, you want to go first?
Yes, and I think that I'm going to bring in the regional dimension of this discussion, because when we talk about the U.S. in the case of Brazil, we cannot avoid talking about the region, because in fact, the disarticulation of Latin America and South America as a U.S. sphere of influence with the ending of the Cold War is one important aspect of Brazil's insertion now as an emerging power. And here I think that what is interesting in the case of Brazil is that Brazil competes with the U.S. in a very deep sense, and I'm going to be a little bit provocative with towards Marcel and what he said before, because when we listen to this idea of Brazil as a multicultural and as a generous multicultural rising power, we can't avoid listening to the U.S. at the same time regarding its inward perception and, of course, a very positive self-ensuring inward perception of diversity, of generosity, et cetera, et cetera. And this is an interesting aspect of Brazil's identity in world politics in our days, because Brazil is, among the BRICS and among the IPSA countries, the only Western rising power or emerging power. And this means that being Western brings in compatible political values with the Western world. And this is an area of contradiction, but also of creativity in Brazil's foreign policies at this time. And definitely Brazil is one of the rising countries, or one of the emerging countries, I'm sorry, to build up and I think there's a lot to exchange with what Varun is doing now. With Brazil is trying to build up a non-liberal oriented foreign policy, particularly dealing with security and political issues, and the approach towards the Arab Spring has been a very good example. And if we go over the different positions of Brazil together with India and South Africa last year at the UN Security Council, when they addressed their Arab Spring issues and crisis, it was very clear that there is a different perception and a different non-liberal peace perception regarding how to deal with these major crises and situations. Now, just to end up, Brazil at this moment is doing much better regarding its global than its regional homework in the build-up of its emerging foreign policy, or its participation in a changing world order. And this has to do, and going back to the US, with a non-resolved aspect of its foreign policy, which is the loss of centrality of the US in Brazil's foreign policy nowadays. There's no doubt about that, but not the build-up of a new option of relationship. And of course, the US has its part of responsibility in the sense that the US has also had an enormous difficulty to understand emerging powers in general and the process of Brazil's change in world order in particular.
Thank you. Alcides, would you like to? Okay.
An aspect to that regarding Brazil. Keep the focus on Brazil. Let me turn on
The universal country.
I share Monica's overall assessment of how Brazil is dealing with that, but I would stress one aspect of that and concerns Mariano's question regarding the second part of your question, how Brazil is dealing with the declining U.S. Brazil has been willing to change its international status quo for several decades. And now, of course, the decline of the U.S. provides a window of opportunity to enhance, to take advantage of it and to enhance its own relative positions in the region and as far as possible in global affairs. Okay, so I think that at the moment Brazil is really interested and motivated in stimulating this process of U.S. decline to the point or to the limit that the Brazil can do first in the region. I think this is the primary focus. Because when we're taking different stances from the U.S. in global affairs, okay, we're also bringing about the sort of reactions that we have had in the past months. Mm-hmm. Okay, the response. Now, in the region, the U.S. seems to be less willing to engage because somehow the U.S. needs Brazil to play a role, a positive role in the region. So that's the dimension in which we can see that Brazil has been more daring in forging regional institutions, selecting even portraying a regional organization without the US and Canada. This can happen, it's quite possible under this logic, within the region, not in global affairs. When you try to deal with Iran, along with Turkey, when you try to get engaged in Middle Eastern affairs, then the constraints are really much stronger than to act more actively within the region.
Okay, I'll give a final word because we're beginning to touch on some of the issues that I'd like to move on towards, but a final word to Oktay.
Very briefly, concerning this debate on U.S. decline, I think we need to be more specific about this discussion. I mean, when we are discussing the U.S. decline, it is not a universal fact. It is a more relative thing. I mean, United States, U.S. power might be seen as in decline if we compare it with U.S. power in 1950s. But when we discuss U.S. power globally and comparatively, it is not in decline. Comparatively speaking, United States is a leading power today, and technologically, culturally, economically, and militarily, and it will remain so in the foreseeable future. What is striking about the United States and its relations with these emerging powers is that is the difference between the policies of George W. Bush and Barack Obama. George W. Bush interpreted this U.S. power in a more unilateralist way and assumed global leadership alone. But it had its own economic costs and some other difficulties because of the burden sharing problem and its impact on U.S. economy. So it is in the interest of United States to work with others in a multilateral way. So Turkey, just like other emerging powers, have been quite positive about cooperating with United States in a more multilateralist framework because this gives some room or some role to play to these emerging powers in that wider context. I think Turkish-American relations have been developing very positively, especially after U.S. adoption of multilateralism. So I can expand on that when I discuss Arab Spring issue.
Thank you very much. I would actually like to move on, if the audience doesn't object. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Arab Spring and the position of emerging and rising powers on the Arab Spring, and whether the regional leadership, particularly I suppose in the case of Turkey, is that stepping stone for a global engagement, and also what has happened after what we've seen happen in Syria. We actually had an event on emerging powers a year ago where a few of you were present. And what was interesting then was it was right after the UN mandate was given to intervene in Libya. And the Libyan military intervention has been portrayed as a great success. But of course, the cost of that intervention has been in Syria. And so I'd like you to sort of think a little bit along questions around the responsibility to protect. How do these emerging powers regard the responsibility to protect? What kind of a challenge is this for established powers? Just expand a little bit. And is it the case that all emerging powers have engaged with the Arab Spring? I mean, does India have a policy on the Arab Spring? I'd just like to open the floor and let you begin discussing that. Would you like to start?
Yeah, I think the Arab Spring really creates fundamental problems for India, because I think India is a democracy, but democracy promotion has not been something that India has ever been particularly enthusiastic about. And I think it's based on a certain understanding of sort of, I mean, democracy in India is seen as being the best way to deal with India's domestic reality. But there has been, I think, always a fair amount of caution about whether that would be the best arrangement everywhere. Now, you could ask why that is the case. I mean, there are several reasons for it. And one of the reasons is that the Cold War made India the only major democracy on the other side of the divide. Even though India was non-aligned for a very long time, towards the end it did have a sort of a real security relationship with the Soviet Union. During the Cold War years and even after, the important point is that threats to India were never seen as threats to democracy. They were seen as threats to India. And this is true. The 1962 border war against China is, I think, the most important of them. But that's true even today. I mean, if you look at the the liturgical role that is made of all the, the 9/11 and post 9/11 terrorist outrages. You'll have sort of 9/11 listed out there in London and Madrid and Bali, but nobody ever talks about Mumbai. So there's a real Indian sense, that India simply has never been a part of that security community of democracies. And, so democracy for India, therefore, has always had a very deep internal meaning, a meaning that, in fact, in sociological terms, gets deeper with every passing week. But it's never really translated, I think, into sort of foreign policy. Another reason is that India's immediate neighborhood has always really been largely undemocratic for most of India's existence as an independent country. And so India didn't quite have that luxury, of sort of playing the democracy card, because you have to deal with your neighbors, and you have to deal with whichever government, whichever regime is in power. It wouldn't have helped Indian policy very much to say that we'll deal with Pakistan once the military leaves and the Democrats arrive, or say that about Nepal or any other country. So you deal with the government that's in power in whichever country. So that's sort of been the Indian. And there was another point here also, which was, had India played the democracy card in its neighbors, it would have weakened the democracy forces in these countries, because they would then have been seen as being largely Indian agents, as pro-Indian forces. So I think there was this sense of reticence, even in terms of sort of the domestic dynamics of these countries. So I think the Indian position has always been that sort of democracy promotion really is ultimately, the arrowhead of Western policy, to serve other interests. And on the whole, India has sort of been therefore quite reticent about this. This, however, does create problems. I mean, for a country that, which has now sort of been saying for quite a while, is one of the major planks of its policy in terms of, its emergence and so on and so forth, is about this, permanent seat with veto powers in the UN Security Council. If you've got to begin to start making some of those decisions, some of those choices. India is currently on the Security Council as a non-permanent member, and we've seen a fair amount of sort of tussle and wrestling within the Indian foreign policy establishment on specific moments. With regards to the Arab Spring, I mean, India had good relations with a lot of these regimes. I think the real big one is one that has still not come before us, which is Iran. And on Iran, it's quite clear that sort of, India is not going to be able to go along with a US or a Western agenda. First of all, there's the energy relationship, just as we talked about Darfur and the rest of it in the context of China, we can say much the same about Iran. But it's not just that. Among the many wonderful things my country is, it's, in contrast to the universal Brazil, India is the world's second largest Sunni country, and also the world's second largest Shia country. Which is what people forget very often when they think about India. The links historically, civilizationally, between India and Iran, are as ancient as recorded history. There are even today families in Lucknow that maintain major shrines in Iraq and Iran, so Shia shrines. So it's a long, deep civilizational history there. And I could give you several other reasons. I mean, within Indian domestic politics, there'd be a huge problem, if there was an overt break with Iran. I think there's plenty more I could say, but I mean, I'm sure you want to sort of spread the discussion around, so I'll stop here.
Well, I think it's very interesting what you're bringing, because I think a lot of us aren't aware of exactly these factors that you're talking about, the history of relations between India and Iran, because you have a tendency to see it as much more tangential. But looking at Turkey, for example, how does this, when Turkey and Brazil got together in 2010 and designed this deal, I remember a conservative pundit calling them the terrible twins of foreign policy. And of course, you've both emphasized how they are interested in a good and cooperative relationship with the US, and yet you have Iran. How do you see it playing out?
I think that initiative of Turkey and Brazil, I mean, maybe inspired by good intentions and good intentions of playing a greater role in world politics, but it was not timely, not also quite successful in the end, because of, I think, one of the problems of these emerging powers, and including Turkey and other countries, which is the lack of coordination. I mean, the whole point about these emerging powers is the idea of multilateralism and being coordinated to other powers as well, not being unilateralist. Intention was, in that case, was quite good, and both countries wanted to contribute to international peace, and the uranium swap was also endorsed by other major powers, but at that specific time, global powers, including Russia and China, they agreed on these sanctions in Iran, and in terms of timing, it was too little too late at that time. But the original intention was quite good, and it was also endorsed at the beginning by the major powers, but the timing was not quite, it was quite late. Not compatible with the existing international context at the time. Concerning the general topic of this round, I would like to say that, I mean, Turkey's interest in the principle of responsibility to protect is a very recent thing. I mean, in the post-Cold War era, Turkey, of course, endorsed few operations concerning this principle, but not out of this idea of humanitarian intervention, but out of its concerns with international security, so which is slightly different. And these cases were Bosnian crisis and the war in Kosovo. I mean, Turkey actively participated in these initiatives, saying that, I mean, somebody should prevent Milosevic from committing these crimes against humanity and undermining security in Europe. But it is quite recent thing in Turkey that Ankara has been interested in these humanitarian principles of protecting these people from the oppressions of the or from oppressive practices of these regimes. And in the Libyan case, Turkey was quite late in supporting the opposition. It maintained its original position. This is the reason why Turkey's policy was not endorsed internationally by international community in the first phase. In the second phase, Turkey aligned itself with the rest of international community. This was a typical case of lack of coordination for an emerging power. But in the Syrian case, maybe by taking lessons from the Libyan case, Turkey acted decisively and supported the principle to protect, and it is still supporting this principle, but it remains to be seen because of the unarmed plan. Turkish position seems to be marginalized, and the other powers and with their own initiatives have been redefining the Syrian crisis, but Turkey, for the first time, advocated the principle successfully, and this also reflected Turkey's overall approach to the Middle East and the Arab Spring. Let me make a few remarks about the Middle East in general and Turkey's policy there, very briefly. The Iranian problem, I think Iranian policies lie at the center of the crisis in Middle East. Turkey, together with other countries, is interested in containing Iranian radicalism in the region, first by supporting Arab Spring. I think the Arab Spring is important for different reasons, for democratization, but also for containing Iranian influence, because Arab Spring will make these regimes more accountable and leave little room for Iran to exploit in the region, because these radical elements will become more responsible and accountable in the eyes of international community. This is, I think, positive element of this is one of the positive elements of Arab Spring. The other thing is that how to deal with Iranian challenge. Of course, both diplomatic and non-diplomatic measures could be utilized. First, diplomatic ones, and this is why Turkey has been supporting these initiatives. But Turkey also cooperates with the international community concerning, for example, NATO's missile defense initiative. If these diplomatic initiatives don't produce the results, expected results, then Iran should be or need to be contained in the end. So, thank you.
Thank you. Monica, did you want to add something?
Yeah, three comments. The first one, I don't want to bring in a new discussion. I mean, we already have enough on the table. But the question of the timing, I wouldn't totally agree, because, I mean, this whole idea of timing, it's never clear who sets the hour. And how, I mean, what timing are we talking about in the sense of the buildup of, in this case, a joint accord and a diplomatic initiative vis-a-vis the escalation of sanctions and the application of sanctions, and of course of tension regarding the Iran situation. And here I think that it's there's a dimension of this accord and of the Turkish Brazilian initiative which is important, which is the precedents, the fact that, I mean, and if we're talking about a transitional period in world politics, we're talking about the building up of new options, new alternatives in diplomatic practices and initiatives. And at least that's my reading of this accord, and the fact that even though it was not effective regarding the results, it was effective bringing up a precedent which is now on the table. Mm-hmm. I would make a comparison regarding the discussion of the expansion of the Social Security Council in the UN. I mean, even though this has not gone forward regarding its effectiveness, but the fact that you have these issues on the table changes metabolism of world politics. And I think that this is one of the contributions of emerging powers at this moment, and then it is definitely the case of Brazil's foreign policy. Now, Brazil's concern vis-a-vis Iran does not have the historic background that the Indian concerns have, but it does have a historic background of itself regarding the non-proliferation regime, mm-hmm. and regarding the flaws of the non-proliferation regime. And the Indian experience is a very clear example of these flaws in the sense of the buildup of its own nuclear program, even though all the pressure that was done at the time was in a way replaced by an accord between India and the U.S. And this is what is behind, I think, the political explanation of why Brazil is concerned regarding at least an alternative approach vis-a-vis the Iranian nuclear program, and the idea that there's not only one way to go, mm-hmm. and that there is not only one result that can come out from a Pacific-ended nuclear program, which is the perception which dominates Brazilian foreign policy at the moment. The second point, which I want to mention, has to do with the R2P and Brazil's perception of R2P and Brazil's insistence upon now the idea that more important than R2P is that interventions are carried forward with responsibility. So it's another way of putting in the question of responsibilities and putting in the question of responsibility when intervention takes place. And the major concern regarding civilian casualties and the costs which of these interventions have imposed upon civilian life, everyday lives, in all cases of intervention. And this perception in the case of Brazil comes together with other critical perceptions of the vocabulary used in our days in the Western world, failed states, the concept of failed states, the question, the whole full concepts now that are used to justify intervention and to justify a whole new way, listening, and in this case, I will personally, not only as an academic, but as a citizen, agree to this stance, in the sense that I think that when we listen to the Secretary of State, the U.S. Secretary of State, justifying what we used to know as covert operations, and now is just explicit foreign policy of a declining power, but of a very powerful power in world politics as the U.S., I think it is definitely an area of concern for emerging powers as Brazil, as India, as South Africa in general. And I think it's a major mistake of the media and of many political interpretations trying to identify this concern with anti-interventionist foreign policy. Brazil had an anti-interventionist foreign policy in the past, yes. But this has nothing to do, this kind of perception and critical perception nowadays has nothing to do with old times anti-interventionist. It's a very nowadays critical perception regarding moving forward in what is now justified and what is now perceived as a legitimate form of military intervention in internal affairs of other states.
Thank you very much. Can I take just a few questions from the audience? Because we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to allow you with just a few. I feel like the discussions have been so good that I haven't wanted to interrupt. But is there one or two questions? I'll give Åsil here. And then Ola. Yeah.
My name is Åsil Kolos. I'm from PRIO. I was wondering if, since this is also wonderfully academic, whether I could stir up a little bit of disagreement between the members of the panel in asking whether there is a kind of a fault line in the perspectives that we're trying to agree on between seeing state sovereignty as something which is has to be accepted as something which is at the center, and state sovereignty is something which is now moving, or is actually a key issue, or whether state sovereignty is a key issue or not. In terms of, are we talking about, is the issue empire and multitude, or is it one continent, one power?
I can take one more question. Well, Ola has a question, and then the young woman in the middle, please, and then we'll have to close, I'm afraid.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that this was mentioned that this is a transitional period, and I think that's very true. I think also when we had conferences in China, in Beijing 5 years ago, my impression was that the Chinese side, or a lot of Chinese people believe or recognized some kind of UN unipolarity. That was the feeling my feeling at the time, at least, and this has to some extent changed. That more of a recognition of a multipolarity, so to speak, and of course this, I think the way development with, for example, the Libyan intervention has strengthened this perception in China. And I think also that the existence of the BRICS, the BRICS countries and so on, it also has something to do, changed the Chinese perception to some extent. So so of course you could say that there are several reasons for why you had the Russian and Chinese veto, but I think these kind of three reasons in combined, I think, could explain something of it. Thank you.
Okay, and then there was a young lady in the middle there, please.
Thank you. My name is Solveig Amat. I'm from the CICERO, Center for Climate Research in Oslo. I have a question regarding environment, and I was wondering the basic alliance that formed during the COP negotiations. Would you think that this is just a one-issue cooperation, where the China, India, Brazil, and South Africa see that they have a common interest on this one issue, and maybe also China, India, and South Africa are hoping to get an impasse on the new hydrocarbon resources of Brazil? Or do you think that this basic cooperation can also spill over to other areas, for instance, the security area within the UN, and that China will also see a less self-centered realist view, and will be more interested in more subtle cooperation and forming a more united power bloc among these countries? Thank you.
Okay, we can start with maybe the last question on the environment and the kind of functionalist argument that if you have cooperation on the climate, can it then spill over into other areas such as security? Is there anyone who'd like to have a go at that? Yeah. Okay.
I think it is important how we define environment. If we define environment as something from a more technical point of view, then it is very unlikely to have spillover effect. But if we see environment as a relational thing, which is an indivisible part of any action, then cooperation in environment would lead to greater cooperation. We need to, I think, be clear about our understanding of environment. It shouldn't be understood in a technical and a marginal issue, more central issue. It is at the center of economic activity, political activity, even military activity. If we see that thing from that global point of view, then definitely it will improve our global awareness of environment and lead to greater cooperation in many fields.
Thank you. Alcides, would you like to add to that?
I'm not that optimistic in the sense that convergences having been reached in one issue area, in one particular regime, spilling over into other issue areas in other regimes. This has to do first with the nature of these of the regimes themselves. Those who are more close, who are closer to more negotiated regimes, okay, you would find this possibility more plausible. It's more plausible. But those hegemonic regimes, such non-proliferation, exports control, trade regimes, in some particular areas of the trade negotiations, you'd find it hard to observe the sort of spillover you are suggesting. Okay. Multilateral, and this touches upon one of the basic characteristics of multilateralism in the contemporary times. That means it's very fragmented. Multilateralism as an international institution is in crisis exactly because of that. Okay, to a great extent because precisely of this difficulty in moving positions and compromise achieved one issue area into other areas so that you can really establish a broader multilateral framework to approach basic global affairs through these institutions. If you look at what's happening to the non-proliferation regime, it's facing a crisis.
Why are you pointing at me?
Because India is a great part of that. It has been said. What's happening at trade negotiations, the Doha round? No.
Look straightforward, please.
Yes, because this, in the case of trade negotiations, it's a very nice example of what I mentioned in my first intervention, that see what's Brazil's share in world trade, and what's the influence Brazil displays in trade negotiations. A huge gap. Okay, but that's the point. I think that one of the reasons that explains the difficulties of multilateralism in present times has to do exactly with this excessive segmentation of issue areas and the different nature of the regimes you take into consideration, whether more negotiated or more hegemonic.
I see that our time is beginning to run out, and I've collected a few questions. If you want to answer the last one?
I'll answer the last one if you will allow me. I'll try to be very, very brief. I'm actually optimistic. And I'm optimistic for this reason. I actually think that there's a new emerging global common sense about the environmental issue area. And it's linked in some ways to the point that was made about it becoming much more of a central issue now. As it becomes clear that it is existential in nature, I think environmental issue areas are going to end up being securitized. That could be both positive and negative, but I think it's going to probably involve much greater policy attention. And I think out here we need to consider another factor, which is generational change. I think that as a different generation reaches positions of power, authority, and influence, I think the centrality of the environmental issue area is going to only increase. And so I have a feeling that because of that reason, it's going to become much more of a hard security issue. Just last week I was in a conference, and I've sort of got into a whole area that I haven't worked on so far, but I finally, sort of thought it's something I just have to confront, and I did, and came up with a conference paper, and that's on river waters, for example, and climate change and the water issues in Asia, but particularly in South Asia, the subcontinent, and some of the issues. And it's becoming quite clear that these are becoming hard security issues. So I'm actually quite optimistic. I actually believe that you will end up seeing a fair amount of concerted action to deal with these issues. The challenge is going to be, in many of these issues like water, to try to avoid zero-sum approaches. Because one of the dangers about securitizing an issue, of course, is that you then sort of get into a zero-sum logic. So how we can sort of try to start working towards having non-zero-sum, understandings and approaches to some of these issues, I think is what one of the core challenges is going to be.
You need the zero problems with neighbors approach, in other words, with regards to the environment as well.
Well, when you're downstream.
Well, exactly. But I'm going to have to, unfortunately, leave the discussion at this point. I'm aware that some of the questions, particularly on sovereignty, weren't answered, but I see that people are beginning to leave. The good thing about this is that, usually when you write, they say you should stop where you could continue next time. We're now stopping at an unanswered question, so hopefully next time when you're back, we'll be able to have some more of these discussions. Thank you very much, the channel. You've really enriched our understanding today. Thank you very much to the audience.